All right. So good evening, everyone. Lovely you could join for the second part of Ethics in the World by Ajahn Santamano. And so last time, a couple of weeks ago, Ajahn treated us to a lot of different types of poems from various Palestinian poets, and which was incredibly very deep. That poetry can say things in a way that normal talking can't sometimes. And I find it very, very, very beautiful to introduce the topic in this way. So we're going to see what Ajahn has in store for us today. I also have no clue whatsoever. So I'll just want to give the word to Ajahn Santamano, and thank you very much, Ajahn, for taking the time to give us a Dhamma talk on this very important subject.
Thank you for the invitation. So again, this time I was reflecting on how what to say, how to speak about this topic of ethics in the and the world, and for myself, I feel the most urgent area is the ongoing genocide in Palestine. And the last time I gave the talk, it was a few weeks ago, and it's still going on, and still no indication of it coming to an end. So that aspect, it's very disturbing. And also so last time, also considering speaking to a general audience, and I don't know to what extent people know or don't know, or what opinions they have. So also considering how to speak about this topic, I would, if I was speaking to a group I knew who was already involved in Palestine solidarity, maybe I would speak in a different way. So last time I just chose a few poems, some June Jordan, Rafif Ziada, Refat Al-Arier, who was killed in Gaza, and in a sense to give that connection, because often how especially a topic like Palestine is presented in the news as so much racism, dehumanization, and we forget that it's not just numbers we are talking about, it's human beings. So this time I was thinking more to tie it into a larger framework of colonization, and also many other wars and conflicts happening around the world, like in Ukraine or Congo, Sudan, Burma, Myanmar. So, and last time the poem I read from June Jordan, that was written around in the 1980s when there was the occupation and attacks that Israel was carrying out in Lebanon. And many of the things she described were very similar to what is happening now in Gaza during this current genocide, or rather an intensification of the genocide. That's a slow process of genocide which has been happening for the last 70 years. So then I thought maybe I selected a few passages, mainly from various historians, and they are from different areas of injustice throughout history. So the first, for example, Herbert Aptheker, he was writing about the various slave revolts and the struggle against slavery. Then maybe after that, Aime Cesaire, he was a poet writing in French, and his discourse on colonialism, where he argues that the European fascism of the 30s and 40s carrying out genocide against Jewish people, against Roma, against LGBTQ people, against disabled people, and the logic, in one sense, it's not so much an aberration as a continuity with European colonial policies, but then that logic of colonialism applied in the towards the population at home, and then various other historians and examples from colonialism, which, because often when talking about Palestine, people can say, oh, why are you just interested in Palestine? But I feel it's important to draw the parallels, draw the connections of the similarity of the ways of thinking, the ways of acting, the strategies for dehumanization that enable these atrocities to continue. So, so this first section, it's from Herbert Aptheker, and this book he wrote in 1969 about the various American slave revolts. So this is, I think, from the introduction. So writing on slave unrest in the United States and doing this in 1969, one feels more like a news reporter than a historian. While recently the California statesman Ronald Reagan, this before he was president, found the ghetto rebels of today to be mad dogs, a South Carolina statesman in 1823 found plantation rebels of his day to be monsters in human shape. And this sort of discourse, one can see how the Palestinian resistance is depicted in current media. Which humans are dogs and monsters depends, I suggest, upon class and often upon color and nationality too. Thus, early in the summer of 1831, the U.S. press was lavish in praise of Polish rebels against Tsarist oppression. So here we can say Ukrainian instead of Polish. None more lavish than the Southern press. But then, late in August, came news of the uprising in Virginia of slaves led by Nat Turner, while a week earlier rebels in Poland were sons of the noble. Now the Virginia rebels were banditti, bloodthirsty wolves, and deluded wretches. How shall one explain this extraordinary shift, except to observe that now the rebels were at home, not 6,000 miles away, and that now the rebels were not white, but black? Humans, no matter of what color, being humans, have rebelled when their treatment was bestial, and when opportunity and capacity for rebellion was present. Slavery, being violative of central religious concepts, and of the founding principles of this nation required an elaborate rationalization. Racism provided this. It derived out of as it sustained the system of modern slavery, that is, the system created in the 16th century as part of the worldwide development of capitalism and the replacement of feudalism. Fundamental to this rationalization was the idea at first of the actual subhumanity of colored peoples. Then the persistence in this became impossible. When persistence in this became impossible, it was altered to affirm the inherent, undeniable, and significant inferiority of such peoples. This rationalization made slavery not only appropriate, believers could now feel absolutely philanthropic while exercising their slaveholding responsibilities and enjoying its benefits. Central to this mythology was the idea that colored peoples did not detest or resent enslavement, particularly black peoples. It was held delighted in their chains. Of course, this mythology had its contradictions. Thus, while it was generally insisted that black people were especially and naturally meek and docile, on the other hand, simultaneously, it was held that they were or could be particularly brutal and savage in quotation marks. So again, the parallels with how Palestinians are depicted, or in any other colonial situation, the people being colonized, um, the justifications that are presented to the population in general to enable that brutalization to continue. And maybe reflecting, say, from a point of view of spiritual practice, from a point of view of sila or ethics, what do we feel? How do we relate when we hear these sort of, or when we read newspaper headlines that depict various groups of people, or specifically Palestinians in this way? Do we take on those ways of thinking for ourselves, or do we reflect on the patterns, on what these media organizations are doing, what they are enabling, what they are justifying? Um, so that reflecting for oneself, where does one's ethical responsibility come in, and what sort of courage does it require to speak about these things, or at least attempt to speak even in contexts where people might believe those ways of thinking, or people might have taken on unreflectively those ways of thinking, and then enable these atrocities to continue. So then the next passage I have from Aime Cesaire. He was, I believe he was from Martinique, and he was a poet writing in French. And this is from the Discourse on Colonialism. I think it was around in the 1940s, just after the Second World War. And often fascism or Nazism is depicted as some sort of uh, very unique evil that is very different from ordinary, and yet he's pointing out the parallels that many of the logics of European colonialism are used, whether it be British or other French, Belgian, other European colonizing forces, and I mean even Germany itself, the genocide they carried out in the early 20th century against the Nama and Herero people in Namibia, and many of the military and people involved in those were the teachers or of the people who perpetrated the genocide against Jewish people and against other groups in the 1940s. So this is Aime Cesaire talking about colonialism. I say that between colonization and civilization there is an infinite distance, that out of all the colonial expeditions that have been undertaken, out of all the colonial statutes that have been drawn up, out of all the memoranda that have been dispatched by all the ministries, there could not come a single human value. First, we must study how colonization works to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him. This is written in the 40s, it's a gendered language. To brutalize him in the true sense of the word, to degrade him, to awaken him to buried instincts, to covetousness, violence, race hatred, and moral relativism. And we must show that each time a head is cut off or an eye is put out in Vietnam, in France, they accept the fact. Each time a little girl is raped in France, and in France they accept the fact. Each time a Madagascaran is tortured, and in France they accept the fact. Civilization acquires another dead weight. A universal regression takes place. A gangrene sets in. A center of infection begins to spread. And that at the end of all these treaties that have been violated, all these lies that have been propagated, all these punitive expeditions that have been tolerated, all these prisoners who have been tied up and interrogated, again the parallels are very obvious, all the patriots who have been tortured, at the end of all the racial pride that has been encouraged, all the boastfulness that has been displayed, a poison has been distilled into the veins of Europe, and slowly but surely the continent proceeds towards savagery. And then one fine day the bourgeois is awakened by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gestapos are busy, the prisons fill up, the torturers standing around the racks invent, refine, and discuss. People are surprised, they become indignant. They say, how strange, but never mind, it's Nazism, it will pass. And they wait, and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves, that it is barbarism, the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms, that it is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices, that they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them. They absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European peoples, that they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, and that before engulfing the whole edifice of Western Christian civilization in its reddened waters. It oozes, seeps and trickles from every crack. Yes, it would be worthwhile to study clinically in detail the steps taken by Hitler and Hitlerism, and to reveal the very distinguished, very humanistic, very Christian bourgeois of the 20th century, that without their being aware of it, has fascism inside of them, that fascism inhabits, that fascism that rails against him. He is being inconsistent, and that at bottom he cannot forgive Hitler. For is not the crime in itself the crime against man? It is not the humiliation of man as such. It is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the black people of America. So often, this was it, I think, in 1948. So often we talk about the post-colonial era, and then imagining that these ways of thinking no longer apply, no longer are valid. People, and yet when it comes to something like Palestine, we see again and again what becomes legitimized, no matter the scale of the genocide. Almost every day we hear some different atrocity being perpetrated, like the massacre at the people collecting the food aid, etc. Let alone all the previous more than 4 months of genocide. And so then this application, the nature of this acquiescence or approval of these going along with these ways of thinking, with these ways of acting, and then the danger that, and then when those ways of thinking start to be applied at home, and I mean at present on a less maybe not affecting everyone, but certainly affecting people who speak for Palestine. So many repressive measures applied by various governments in North America and Europe. And also, Aime Cesaire wasn't the only one writing in around the 40s. Other groups, say, radical black intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, George Padmore, or Oliver Cox also understood fascism not as some aberration from the march of progress, so sort of unexpected right-wing turn, but a logical development of Western colonization itself. So they viewed fascism as a blood relative of slavery, imperialism, global systems rooted not only in capitalist political economy, but racist ideologies that were already in place at the dawn of modernity. So this is Ralph Bunche. He was writing in 1936, and so the doctrine of fascism, with its extreme jingoism, its exaggerated exaltation of the state, and its comic opera glorification of race, has given a new and great impetus to the policy of world imperialism, which had conquered and subjugated to systematic and ruthless exploitation virtually all the darker populations of the earth. And this way of thinking, again, one can see in the way the Israeli state presents itself, or the logic that is used in media. And then so this is W.E.B. Du Bois. He was a great one of his major books was Black Reconstruction, which was analyzing the Reconstruction after the Civil War, when slavery technically ended, and then the critical role that the enslaved people who escaped from the South during the Civil War played as a sort of general strike in the defeat of the South. And this was, I think, written in the 40s. It's freely available on the internet. So this one is another quotation from W.E.B. Du Bois. I knew that Hitler and Mussolini were fighting communism and using race prejudice to make some white people rich and all colored people poor. But it was not until later that I realized that the colonialism of Great Britain and France had exactly the same object and methods as the fascists and the Nazis were trying clearly to use. And then this was, I think, in the 30s. And then later, in 1947, from a book called The World and Africa, he writes, there was no Nazi atrocity, concentration camp, wholesale maiming and murder, defilement of women, or ghastly blasphemy of childhood, which Christian civilization or Europe had not long been practicing against colored folk in all parts of the world, and in the name of and for the defense of a superior race born to rule the world. So I feel it's very, very important to notice these parallels and then reflect for oneself to what extent are we or have we taken on these ways of thinking, and then as we listen more to Palestinian scholars or poets or artists, and listen to what they are saying about the situation, not only the current genocide, but what they were subjected to before October the 7th. And then in terms of doing something that in one sense comes later, but more just as a starting point to reflect, reflect for oneself. Are there these ways of thinking that we might have unconsciously internalized, and then are they operating in how we might understand what we hear in the news, how we understand the framing. Um, um, so then this next one is Stephen Lindqvist. So he was, I believe, from Sweden, a scholar and historian. And one of his books, I think it's a history of aerial bombardment. So the amount of aerial bombardment that has been used in Gaza, it's truly shocking. Almost all civilian infrastructure, accommodation, universities, hospitals have been destroyed, and mostly focusing on civilian targets. So many, most of the people killed have also been civilians. So he, in this book, Stephen Lindqvist, and I'll give a list of all these books, etc., to whenever we mull later, so they can maybe put on the for people to see. But in this book, he's describing the history of aerial bombardment and how, again, that started in a sort of colonial context. So the first recorded aerial bombardment was carried out, I believe, by Italians when they were colonizing Africa in Tripoli on November 1st, 1911. And there was a whole debate at the time of the ethics of bombing civilians indiscriminately from the air. But unfortunately, because it was non-Europeans, and that sort of process continued. Like in 1913, again, the Spanish bombed various villages in Morocco, and then British, of course, after the First World War, carried out many bombings in Afghanistan, Iraq, Palestine, Egypt, Africa since 1919, instead of using infantry or artillery. Then a Spanish bombing of Morocco in 1925. Many people know the bombing of Guernica, which happened in 1937 during the Spanish Civil War. But a very similar case was a Moroccan village of, oh, I probably can't pronounce it, Chechaouen in 1925, with very similar size and very similar bombing. But Guernica is, of course, much better known because of also the painting by Picasso. And if we look at Gaza, almost every week there's another Guernica. And for the last, 4 or 5 months. So I probably won't be able to talk about all the other conflicts, but maybe to mention briefly the Congo, but not so much what is happening now as the historical context, and especially as I'm staying in Belgium at the moment, and the role Belgian colonization played in the Congo during the time of King Leopold. and the sort of one of the introductory books about this, the one by Adam Hochschild, King Leopold's Ghost, a story of greed, terror, and heroism in colonial Africa. And I believe at the time Congo was used mainly for rubber extraction, rubber, ivory, timber, and the brutal practices of labor practices that were used in many of the places, especially for the rubber extraction. So the workers were given quotas for the day and to collect a certain amount of sap, and then if they did not fulfill those, then many of them had their hands cut off. And the sort of systematic cruelty, systematic brutality, and exploitation of the colonization at that time. And then when eventually Congo attained independence, and then the first democratically elected, I believe he was Prime Minister, he was Patrice Lumumba, and his main policy was that the resources of the Congo, because it's an extremely resource-rich country with a lot of copper, many other resources. So his main contention was that the resources of the country should be for the benefit of the people of the country, and then through the various machinations of, I believe Belgium was very heavily involved. He was eventually assassinated, and some of the mercenaries, so the killers, I think they dissolved his remains in acid, and some of them they kept teeth or bones as such mementos. And I believe it was only a few years ago that the Belgian government returned maybe a gold tooth or to his family. And then after his murder, Congo was taken over by various factions that supported Western imperialism, and so the conflict that has been almost continuously ongoing since that time, and at present there's a more intensification. But I believe various groups that control different regions which have different resources have agreements with various mainly North American, I believe there's a lot of Canadian mining companies, also from United States, some from Europe. So they have agreements with those companies to extract those resources in that particular area, and then that enables, and then the money, resources that those groups controlling those local areas they gain, then they they continue the conflict with other groups. So then the country itself is not able to establish a sort of a stable government. And then how it is often depicted in the news is that these people in Africa, they are uncivilized and they can't from governments, etc. And yet, I feel it's important to realize how it is intricately part of the sort of neo-colonial system that still operates today. So then I had other examples, maybe some from India, but maybe I just mentioned them briefly, like the famine in, during the British occupation of India, there was many famines over the years, but I believe the worst one was Bengal famine from around 1943 to 1944. When it seems, at least through studies of various scholars like Utsa Patnaik or Mike Davis, almost as a deliberate policy to extract resources in order to fund the British war effort, and then creating those conditions where the famine would be far worse than it needed to be. Many millions of people died, or the massacre in Punjab in 1919 in Jallianwala Bagh, where a crowd of protesters, they were having a meeting in a enclosed space, and then the British uh, general or brigadier at the time, he surrounded them and just opened fire, killing. The estimates vary from around 400 to 1,000 people, with more than 1,000 injured. And again, in Gaza, almost every day, the Jallianwala Bagh has been happening. And then maybe finally, just briefly to talk more specifically about Palestine, or the specific historical context. I might have mentioned a little last time, but maybe just to mention a few main points. So, in 1948, when the state of Israel was formed, the sort of systematic ethnic cleansing that is known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe in Arabic, where more than 500 villages and small towns were destroyed, and the people from those towns were expelled, so that to minimize the number of Palestinians who were still left in what became the state of Israel, and they became sort of expelled to what is now the West Bank and then Gaza. So again, there's more than around 4 to 5 million refugees. Uh, Many people in Gaza are also refugees, and also many outside of Palestine. So the three main there's the refugees, the four main areas. The refugees outside of Palestine, then there's the people in Gaza, which was Gaza and West Bank, and they were occupied when Israel invaded its neighbors in 1967 and occupied East Jerusalem, Gaza, West Bank. Um, So in Gaza itself, it's been a sort of after Israel withdrew settlements in 2006. It's been closed off on all four directions, with what control Israel mainly controlling what can go in, what can go out, and then the West Bank, where systematically, almost immediately after 1967, many large settlements started being built and then the population from Israel occupying those settlements, building separate road systems for the settlers, and which Palestinians whose land it is cannot use. And just the ongoing brutalization of the Palestinian population, to whom military law applies, because it's a military occupation, and then the settlers, which is a war crime, I believe, Geneva Conventions, or where the occupying power moves its civilian population into an area it is militarily occupying. So all these settlements are illegal on international law, and yet they keep expanding. And even during this current genocide, there has been an intensification of violence by both the Israeli military and then also settlers. And then also there's the Palestinian citizens of Israel, around 20% of the population, who and there's more than 50 laws that discriminate against them. So even if they have citizenship, many of they have so many laws that discriminate against them. And in 2016, there was a UN report that argued that Israel is practicing apartheid in all three of these areas: Gaza, West Bank, and 1948 Palestine, or what is the state of Israel. And then more recently, B'Tselem, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, etc., also put out reports. And of course, Palestinian scholars have been arguing this for decades. And then, so this is just, and then to end, I'll have a short poem by a Palestinian poet, but this is just some feedback I got from the last talk. Maybe I read it out. So I feel for many people who will resonate with your message will need more simple and direct suggestions for actions they can take to make it more concrete. For example, living more simply so that you can donate your income to aid organizations, or calling political representatives, or attending marches, or public speaking, if people have a platform, and then what they're hearing from their friends, that their sense of confusion and helplessness often stops them from taking action. So what they try and encourage is simple offerings of what they can actually do to harness the pain they might feel, or pain or anger into action in the world. So that was just some reflections I had, and then to end, maybe I share a poem by Suhair Hamaj, and this again a common theme of the repeated patterns. So this poem she wrote, I believe, in 15 years ago, around 2009, after the assault on Gaza then. So it's called Gaza Suite. I think it's just she wrote 5 of them. So this just the first one. So I offer that for reflection, and again, it's if anything has been useful, please feel free to take it. But if you haven't resonated or agreed with something I said, please feel free to leave it behind.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you very much, Ajahn. One thing before I open up the floor, one thing that strikes me in all the conflicts that you have brought up in your talk, it's always about greed, hatred, and delusion on a grand scale, and especially the delusion of self, of its identity as self as opposed to the other, and then in a group. So it's like first there is the me self, but there's also the group that I belong to, that identity of the group that you belong to based on race, gender, nationality, or whatever, as opposed to another group. And the other group is then inferior, or you feel that as the group that is inferior and another group is superior. And that whole dynamic creates so much suffering in the world. And it all boils down to this feeling of self inside of each one of us. And that's why it's so important to practice to look at, where is this sense of self? Where do I feel better or worse than another person? And not to beat yourself up, because actually this conceit is something that is so deep down, and it tends to it's one of the last fetters to go before somebody becomes an arahant. So it is a very, very deep conceit, but to recognize it first of all, and to understand what it is. And also, of course, the greed and hatred, it's all has to do with this old sense of self as well. So all the greed, quite often greed for land, greed for the natural richness of the land, that's quite often topics that come back in conflicts. Somebody has something that another group wants, and yeah, so like you said, this one person on YouTube, I think she asked, or this person asked about things that we can do. And yes, we can do things in the outside world. We can also look inside ourselves and see, where do we feel superior or inferior, and why, and what is going on there. And to learn to understand ourselves, then we also learn to understand others, and we learn to understand the world. One thing I found really powerful at some point, when I heard about a black man who went to Ku Klux Klan meetings in the United States, and he started befriending Ku Klux Klan members. And at some point, these Ku Klux Klan members, they couldn't stay with the Ku Klux Klan anymore, because that image they had of the violent, barbarian black man, they couldn't hold that up, because they had a friend who was black and who wasn't like that. So they when you start to get to know people, then you cannot keep that difference anymore in your mind. yeah, that's all these things that we can do as well. So I just wanted to share my thoughts on that. Sorry, I've been going on a bit too long, but are there any questions? Comments in the chat there?
Yeah, if there are any questions, now you can unmute. I believe it should be.
Or you can just unmute, it's just a small group. Yes, exactly. Or here, of course.
And I mean, if not, that's fine as well.
That's
It's
fine as well,
already
yes.
past 8. So.
Mm. I also think if you do start to work on yourself, and I think all of you do already, because otherwise you wouldn't be in a Buddhist monastery, then you start to also become more aware of the things that you can do and the little things that you can do to help other people, and to also care for this feeling of helplessness that you might feel, and to stay with that with love and kindness and compassion. And then at some point, some ideas will come up of what you can do, even if it's just on a small scale. One thing I recently read in the last couple of days is something I thought about when you started talking in the beginning, is that there was a Girl Scout group in the United States. I don't know if you've read that, who started baking cookies, as Girl Scouts in the US do, and raising funds. And usually they raise funds for themselves, for their own organization. And this Girl Scout group started raising funds for the Ukraine, with selling their cookies. And they were awarded and praised for that action of doing that. And then there was another Girl Scout group who started making bracelets for Palestinian, to raise money for the children in Palestine. And that group was told off by the leadership of the Girl Scouts, that they shouldn't do something that was political. And of course, this coming out in the paper, there were it became quite a big thing, obviously. And this Girl Scout group, they have split themselves up from the Girl Scouts and formed their own group and continued selling their bracelets. And they got an enormous amount of support from the local communities, and raised a lot of money also for the Palestinian children. So, but just it shows also how we have different opinions about different conflicts depending on who is involved. And personally, I was like, if you're raising money for children, that's not political. No matter how you look at it. If you just want to help children go through a very difficult time, that's not political. Yeah. Anyway, I want to leave it at that, because I can continue on for another half hour myself, but I won't do that. So,
yeah, thank you for the invitation. Thank you everyone for joining. Araham Samma Sambuddho Bhagava Buddha Bhagavan Dhamma Vivaremi Swakato Bhagavata Dhammo Dhamma Namasami Supatipano Bhagavato Sāvaka Sangho Sangha Namami